Did somebody say I love lamp? Welcome, everybody. From the deepest, darkest corner of Toronto, it's Tristan with Step Back Tonight! Just imagine there's applause happening right now. Ah! Hey, everybody! Oh my, I see a whole bunch of you are already in here. Oh boy, this is going to be exciting. Hello everybody, welcome to Step Back Tonight, the weekly show, weekly nightly show, where we do all sorts of fun and cool stuff, and hang out with you guys, some cues, and hang out with the cat, of course, and you guys, you end up in a situation where we do a thing. So here we are. I see a lot of the regular suspects are in here. I see Only Bro and Ron and NC Flame and Big Seltzer, and I think I saw Anarcho Fledgling, but the chat has, oh, there's Rat. Like, all right, we already got all sorts of good folks in here. Ah, man, how are we all doing, friends? Today's stream is going to be fun. So I'm going to talk to you guys for a little bit, answer some questions, and then we'll do some sort of alternate history scenarios, if we will. Should probably fully button this up so I look fancy. Hello, Logan. Night Watcher's pet. Gotta give you powers. All right. Oh boy. Yeah. So 25580 saying, "I'm sorry, I unloaded my emotional angst onto your Discord and accused you of driving leftist to existential despair. I was in a deep funk the other day. I think everybody was last week between the I don't know, between the release of that Philosophy Tube video and that Thoughtslime video, like on the same day, I think everybody was going through a moment last week. And if you haven't seen those videos, I suggest that you hang on to them and don't watch them while you're emotionally vulnerable. Save them for while you got some time to think about stuff. High school is still a thing, so it could be better. Oh man, high school, that's old school. Yeah, I think people were talking about, like, I don't know, I think I said I started a YouTube channel in 2007, and then someone was like, oh, I waited until after high school to get my YouTube channel. And I was just like, so did I. Oh man, because I graduated high school in 2006, June of 2006. So thoughts on the lamp meme? Is that the whole like moth memes? Is this just another word for the moth memes? Because if that's the case, then yeah, I think they're awesome. I'm glad that moth memes are a thing that exist. All right, so I already got my first question. It's pretty regular. Oh, and also last week all the Brett Kavanaugh crap went down. Yeah, man, last week was not an easy week to be a person. Holy crap. Yeah. So first question we got here is by NC Flame, asking how my day was. This day was actually pretty good. I'm trying to pick up some new habits this week, and trying to do a few small activities every day to help me with my focus. So I've been trying to get more exercise every morning, and I've been trying to stop kind of like faffing around in the morning and not doing much until my wife leaves for work. So I've decided to, just start the day working. And that including exercising and meditation and things like that. So I've been like trying to incorporate those into my week, and today was the first day where I did all the things together, and it was a pretty good day. I basically spent... Today it was like overcast and rainy outside. Like, it's been raining all day, and it's been kind of shitty out. But luckily I got to stay home tonight, and I spent the whole day basically working on Thursday's video. And Thursday's video will be Thursday's video is going to be interesting. I'm going to try to get to a whole... I'm going to try to do a whole thing. I'm trying something to try and capitalize on popular video game releases, so... yeah, here's a new ideology for the 21st century, and that is Marxism, Lampism, Mothism. I like it. I like it a lot. Yeah, so here's some other things I can add on to how this... If this is your first time here, this is a weekly show I do every Tuesday night, and we hang out. The one thing I should mention is that if you prefer to watch your streams on Twitch, I am on Twitch at twitch.tv/stepbackhistory, if that is where you prefer to watch your streams. But if you're happy here, then we're happy here. Yeah, and I hang out, we answer questions, we do stuff, and I try to find an activity for us to do every single week, so here we are. So first things first. I just keep kind of answering some questions and seeing where we go. So, what if Lenin didn't die and Stalin comes? That sounds like an alternate history scenario. I'll put that in the list here. Only Bro 555. How will the alternate histories work? That's a very good question. So my plan is that I'm just going to take a few of them down and just, you know, put them on a list and see which ones people in the chat want. Maybe I'll make a straw poll or something, and we'll start with the most popular one and just kind of work on them from there. And we'll take feedback from the audience and write some stuff out, and it'll be fun, hopefully. What if Danny Shays succeeded and the Constitution wasn't a thing? So let's put that on there. Okay. Yeah. Has there been some more questions? Yes. Okay. Let me just write down some. Let me just copy down some of these. Let's take that. Okay. Let's take a few of these. Let's see. Okay. Brother, we must seize the means of lamp. Oh boy. All right. Okay. I did not know Moth was taking off so much. That's really good. It's my it's a pretty fun meme. Okay, we've got a whole bunch in a very situational. All right. All right. Let's just go through these questions, and then we'll see. Like, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat here. Because you guys are just throwing ideas, and we'll go through it in a second. So, okay, first one, Only Bro 555. Okay, we did how do the alternate histories work. JP Huff and stuff. What are your tips for someone who wants to meditate but haven't started yet? Start small. Basically, if you think about it, since free will really doesn't exist, you don't have a whole lot of control over your thoughts. So, I would say if you want to start if you want to start meditating, what you should do is start with something very simple, like 5 minutes, where you just don't entertain thoughts when they come to you. Thoughts just pop up. That's just kind of how our brain works. It's not exactly a thing you can control. It's almost like a bodily function, but you have to, like, just sort of let the thought come and go and not, you know, elaborate or entertain it, and just kind of do that for about 5 minutes. The best way to do that, sort of not focus on your own internal thoughts, is to focus on your breaths. I find counting to 10 and then starting over. and not really caring about losing count or anything like that. It's just a way to give you a thing to focus on, and sort of get yourself out of your head, and in directing your focus on your body and how it's reacting to things. And I find that that is a very good way to do it. But honestly, like, if you're just starting, especially if you're like me and have ADHD, that like 5 minutes is a good way to start. We would probably have some more. You can probably work it up from there. So that would be. Yeah. Okay, let's get these. We have a lot of communist ideas, so let's see. What's the next question we got here? What is the best what's the best workout you've done? Oh, geez, I don't even know. I don't actually measure my time or my distance really, so I'd have to start doing that in order to give you a number. To be honest, I think that the biggest workout that I ever did, the best workout I ever did, was when I got lost in what's it called? In the massive cemetery, the military cemetery in Washington, D.C. I'm trying to remember the name of it off the top of my head. I don't know why it's escaping me at the moment. Arlington Cemetery. And we tried to get in through this entrance that's by where the Pentagon is. Because we had to go see the 9/11 memorial at the Pentagon. And so I went to the Pentagon memorial. We checked it out, and there's an Air Force memorial very close by. And then we tried to get in to Arlington, which is like right by. And we went in to the room, or we went into to go into the building, or what's it called, into the cemetery, and it was like locked off, and there was like some like military guard there who basically told the two of us that like, no, you guys can't go in through that entrance. There's only one entrance for people to get in and out, and so you have to go in through that. And what we found out is, not only was that like very far away, but it was on the other, like it was on the other side of the cemetery. And on top of that, because it's America, there's no sidewalks. So our path to Arlington Cemetery involved walking on like the grass by the side of the highway the entire trip. And then when we walked around and got all the way up, we then decided to go into Arlington Cemetery and walk around and see all the stuff that was in Arlington Cemetery. And then we walked back, and this time we walked across the bridge into downtown DC, and the sun was going down, and we hadn't eaten, and we were exhausted, but this was our first time to be on that side of the mall. So then we ended up seeing like the Lincoln Memorial, and we ended up seeing the Vietnam Memorial, and I just realized I actually don't even need to be wearing headphones right now. So we saw like all the memorials, and as soon as the memorials were like, as soon as we had gone through all those places, I'm gonna apologize. I'm gonna mute the microphone so I can move my microphone for a second. So once we got to a position where the once we had seen all the memorials on that side of the mall, we decided to go get supper, and we weren't able to do that because, if you don't know anything about Washington D.C., is that that part of downtown Washington D.C. closes at like 5 o'clock, and this was probably like 7-ish, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, and so we had like walked a considerable amount. I think that like we were wearing Fitbits at the time, and I think that we had both gotten like upwards of 70 or 80,000 steps that day, so it was a pretty long walk day. I guess that'd be my best workout. Oh, that was a lot of things. Oh man. That's another thing. Terry's like, I think this audience might have a left-wing bias, and it's interesting because like somebody the other day just said that they were like, I still get these comments like every few days or so, but like they were surprised to find out that I had left-wing tendencies. Like, that was like an actual surprise in their book. And, yeah, that surprised me quite a bit, because I was just like, it wasn't obvious by now. Like, every once in a while, like, there'll be these people who will be like, oh yeah, like, I thought you were cool until, like, this video. Like, this particular video I watched, and I found out that you were, like, some sort of beta SJW cuck, and now I'm gonna unsubscribe. And you look at their channel, and they were, like, subscribed to me and, like, all of, like, the worst parts of YouTube, and I'm like, what am I doing that's not scaring these people away? Until, like, you know, do they find some strange, I don't know. It was very interesting. Okay. I know, Terry. It just reminded me of an interesting interaction that happened. That happens on a regular basis. All right. So I've got a handful of alternate histories here that you guys have submitted. It looks like we've got 12 of them. So some of these I think also overlap quite a bit, but let's see what we're looking at here. So what if Lenin didn't die and Stalin didn't come to power? That'd be interesting. What if Danny Shays succeeded and the Constitution wasn't a thing? You're talking about Shays Rebellion? Oh gosh, that is some old school America stuff right there. I'm trying to remember Shays Rebellion. I used to teach American history, so this is bad. Let me just look it up real quick to see which one it is, because there's so many rebellions that you need to be on top of. So Shays Rebellion, 1877, American Revolutionary War. It's a protest against perceived economic and civil rights injustices. Okay. 1787, the rebels marched in the United States Armory at Springfield. It was an unsuccessful attempt to seize the weaponry and overthrow the government. The federal government found itself unable to finance troops to put down the rebellion and oh, yes, Shays Rebellion. So this was like the straw that broke the camel's back that forced the Americans to basically abandon the Articles of Confederation and make the Constitution. Okay, that's interesting. Now I remember this. I'm just going to make another tab in this program here, and I'll put your questions down if they're not related to the alternate history. Yeah. Patrick Anders, where do you work now? Well, I'll put that in the thing. I'm going to get to questions once we've like chosen an alternate history scenario. All right, the third one we got here is what if the Central Powers won World War I? I think that'd be interesting. There's a lot to chew on with that. What if the U.S. labor movement succeeded? I feel like that's a little... I like the idea behind it, but it also is very... It's very vague. Like, trying to like figure out what the point of divergence is there would be a little difficult. So, not that I hate the idea. It's just I think we're gonna have to. I think that the other ones we can do a little bit more chewing on. What if the socialist revolutionaries took over Russia instead of the Bolsheviks? That'd be interesting. We've got another Russian Revolution one. What if Marx was right and the USSR sparked a global communist revolution? Okay. What if memes went very mainstream? What if Rosa Luxemburg survived the Freikorps? I am not really like knowledgeable about this part, so I think I'm gonna have to ditch that. Sorry. What if America gained independence as a Commonwealth of Britain similar to Canada? Okay. What if the American Revolution went all the way, like abolition, land reform, that stuff? Okay. What if polytheism remained popular? How it affect social progress? Okay. And, okay. And we'll add this one, because this one seems cool. What if Abraham Lincoln hadn't been assassinated? These are good. These, I think that they can let us go into a bunch of directions. For the so, do you guys want to vote on these, or do you want me to just start at the top and see what we can come up with? Because like we can could do a few, and then when we get to, I don't know, when we get to 8 o'clock, we can sort of come around at the end, you know. Mm-hmm. Okay. You guys want to vote on it. All right, I'm going to make a hopefully straw poll. I'm going to do a vote. I think vote would... I've never used straw poll before, so I'm a little worried about it, but let's see. Oh no, I've lost the chat. Yeah, let's vote. Michael Kirshner, people were just saying them in the chat and I was just adding them. So if you have one, then you know, go for it. I'm sure we can do another alternate history night and I can hold on to some of these and move on to the next one. So let's, oh my, okay. Let's see. Let's just, okay, I got an idea. I'll take the first few, and we'll see where it goes from there. So I'm just copying it over. Okay, it's not. It's better than I thought it was. So I'm just going to add all of them, and I'll see live which one starts to come out ahead. And then once I get the straw poll going, I'll answer some of the questions that were not alternate histories that I saw, and then go from there. And once people have had time to fill out the poll, then we can go from there. Okay. Oh my, there's a whole lot in here. You guys are so busy. Okay. Let me just check to see if there's any last ones thrown in here. Okay. Let me create the poll. All right, I'm going to put it in the chat. And it's like he's watching tennis. So just kind of vote in that, and I'm going to put in my votes and see where it goes. So you can check as many as you'd like. I imagine that will make things a little bit better. Yeah. So I'm going to vote myself real quick. Actually, well, I'm just going to look at the results. All right. So while you guys are voting in that poll, be sure to do that. And then we'll see where things go. All right. So in the meantime, I have a couple questions that were asked, and I will answer those, and then we'll give you guys time to do your votes. So 255 AD. Suppose that there was some sort of civilization. Oh wait, it's an alternate history. Patrick Anders, where do you work now? I still work for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. It's sort of like the Canadian equivalent of the ACLU. And in that job, I basically make YouTube videos for that organization. So I've been doing that for a while now. I have a lot of videos that I've made, but they're like waiting on like earned media opportunities, so they're just kind of sitting there for the moment. But oh my, lots of diversity in people's opinions here. Interesting. Oh boy, there's a whole lot. Okay. Interesting, interesting, interesting. All right. I can see that there's two that are coming out on top. I'm going to see if we can break the mold a little bit and see if one can pull ahead. But I'll grab the most popular one soon, and then I will. But you guys can keep voting, and I'll choose the next most popular one after that. That seems to be a way to make it work. But interesting. I've never done a straw poll before, so I'm very new to this. Is it ethical to let adult people with learning disabilities opt to end their own lives? Ooh, that is a tough question. So, I would hope that the choices of people who have learning disabilities are still considered valid. And that, you know, there's the whole, like, you have bodily autonomy over yourself, whether you are, you know, conditionally able to make those decisions in an informed manner. And most people with learning disabilities could probably do that. It would be up to them. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. I would probably think that people's relatives and such would probably still do work to, you know, talk somebody out of ending their own lives, which is definitely something that I think the old term that it's a temporary solution to a permanent, or it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, and that's something that I'd be keen to tell anybody who was actually, like, thinking of ending their own lives in a, like, rational, like, sort of long contemplated sort of way. For the most part, though, most suicides are not done like that, and they're not something that they're usually done with in the heat of the moment without much forethought or planning. And in those cases, the biggest thing that someone can do is just be there for that person, either on the phone or in some way to intervene, and just sort of talk to them long enough before they can commit to something like that. And that happens in a lot of cases, and it's quite tragic when that happens. I think that's a very different thing, though. That's a very different sort of state of mind than, like, the other situations, like when somebody is, like, you know, right to die type things. Yeah, intellectual disabilities, that's an ethical gray area. In my mind, that is very much like a very basic, like, it would be very dependent on the people, the person who is making the decision involved. Like, I think that a lot of these things are not really something that you can have a huge policy about. It's very much dependent on the people. When I think of learning disabled people, I think of me. I have ADHD, which is a learning disability. All right, so okay. We've got a handful of votes. If anyone hasn't gotten their vote in, right now we have leading two different ones, which is what if polytheism remained popular, and what if Lenin didn't die and Stalin didn't come to power. So those are the two that are at the top. So I guess we'll start with what would be the most fun one to start with? I feel like the polytheism one will be take a little bit of work to go on. So let's start with this. Let's start with if Lenin didn't die, or if Lenin didn't die and Stalin didn't come to power. So, all right. So let's go to our alternate history here. So let's take this text, start a new tab. So, what if Lenin didn't die and Stalin didn't come to power? Let's think through what would happen. First thing I would probably say, so, like, where did Stalin and Lenin disagree on things? And that, sometimes there's a little bit of a voodoo art in that, because I know that there's a lot, because Lenin was only, like, you know, in charge for a brief period of time, that Lenin's, like, positions on some things are subject to interpretation. But we can definitely see what hard direction Stalin went when he was in this situation. So I think that one of the first things that we should probably acknowledge is that... Okay. Interesting. One of the first things we should probably acknowledge is that Lenin staying in power would definitely not mean that, like, Stalin and Trotsky, for example, get, like, put into a cannon and fired into the sun. So the two of them would still be at each other's, they'd be each other's ideological rivals with their two concepts about what to do. So, okay. So Lenin doesn't have his strokes, and he goes on living. Civil War ends, and Vladimir Lenin is the first ruler of the USSR. And this is like already like, what do you even, where do you even go from here? Because Lenin's approach to the communist transition is probably fairly different from Stalin's in the ways that I can think of are, one, Lenin was a little bit more pro markets, not like that he loved them, but he was much more of like the let's transition out of a market economy into the communist economy. I imagine that Lenin would probably probably wouldn't do like the 5-year plans. So that's the first thing we're going to need to think through is the 5-year plans. And like, you know, everything that stands for, like the planned economy and like what, any of those kinds of things. When is your wife going to come home and give you carbonated water? Hopefully around a little after 8 o'clock. So yeah, so we're going to we'll just do economics here. The other big issue is going to be about what to do about international communism. I think those are like the big things where Stalin and Lenin would drastically differ. So the first thing, let's talk about the difference between Lenin and Stalin when it comes to economics. So Stalin and Lenin both believed that, as Marx had written, that communism would only be 100% successful once a society has been sufficiently industrialized. It's part of what Marx has written about, that he actually thought that the communist revolution would happen in the most industrialized country, not the least industrialized country. And by 1924, because of the Civil War and because of the policies of the Romanov government, Russia was pretty backwards. It was lagging pretty far behind when it came to economic development in the rest of European countries. So after World War I, there's a loss of power for the there's loss of power in Germany, things like that. So I do think that one of the things that Lenin would have gone for the economy was that he was much more pro transitionary economies. Like he wanted to modernize with like a, you know, pushing up and kind of getting things moving. Can you elaborate on the labor notes part? But like trying to use the money system and use the economy to move towards a more push-up thing. And yeah, trying to change the workplaces in some ways. I don't think the Finnish Bolshevik is fully correct on trying to make like workplaces more democratic, because in a revolutionary state like this, Lenin would be probably still trying to, with a strong fist, get the economy up and running. Now, what Stalin did when it came to economics was he really fully instituted the planned economy. And honestly, with Stalin still alive, like Stalin would still probably be a close advisor to Lenin. So I do imagine that Stalin would still, I think, okay, one thing that we should add is that Stalin would still be power hungry. That was very much his personality even before Lenin died. And so I do think that one thing we need to add is that Lenin will be dealing with Stalin as sort of this power-hungry rival. So there might be issues where Stalin is trying to amalgamate a power base and overthrow the Leninist government. And I do think that some of these, like with Trotsky and Stalin having this like legendary rivalry, that both of them would start off by trying to influence Lenin's policies. And I'd probably say on economics, because Stalin had more to say, that maybe you wouldn't get 5-year plans, but you'd still get a pretty planned economy. So you'd still have a very top-down oriented economy. You might not have the like direct like 5-year plan, but you still have a pretty over-the-top, like very centralized economy. Because they would be planning it, and if you think about the intellectual ideas that were going on at the time, that things like social science and the concept of having lots and lots of plans was very popular at that time, and so I do think that a lot of the Soviets would probably still be on board with that, and so I do think that because they're building their economy from scratch for the most part, that there'd still be planned economies. But I do think that they would not be as, because like the thing about Stalin is that he tried to embrace like levels of production that were just higher and higher and higher with disregard for who could actually use them. There's a lot of very infamous stories about 5-year plans of economic benchmarks that were impossible to hit, and also that Stalin would try to, over the top, like make things like make more boots than people could possibly need. And I do think that Lenin might have tempered that a little bit. So maybe it would be a little bit like, what would be communism with Russian characteristics. So you'd have probably, while you'd have a harsh top-down planned economy, I think that the harsh benchmarks and the like very like over-the-top boss-pleasing aspects and the like revisionist history stuff would probably be reduced quite a bit. And so I'm gonna say like it's a more successful. It's still an authoritarian economy, but it's still fairly responsive to the things that people need. Maybe a process of nationalizing areas of industry, and trying to elaborate on that, like trying to turn everything into like what would be in Canada called a crown corporation, and then sort of building from there. Yeah, we'll get into World War II in a moment. So, international communism. So the other big thing that Trotsky and Stalin would be duking it out over was whether or not the Soviet Union should raise a, communist Red Army and use it to essentially overthrow the rest of the world and, push the permanent revolution across the planet. And so Trotsky very much was over the top with saying that Trotsky was very much a person who wanted to... Now, of course, Shakespeare wasn't Russian. Shakespeare was Klingon, as we all know. Because you haven't read Shakespeare until you've read it in the original Klingon. Anyways, international communism, the idea that the USSR should be spreading communism around the world by force. I do think that Trotsky's idea would very much run into the problems that come with the rubber meeting the road, because Trotsky was very ideological. And so I would think that you would need to start with how that would meet each other. And so the post-World War I consensus with the League of Nations and things like that would probably cause a lot of issues with that concept, So I think that a lot of Trotsky's ideas, while they would be good in idea, would probably run into problems to do with the growth of like the League of Nations and things like that. But I do think that relying on nationalism would not be a thing that, which is what Stalin did, would not be a thing that Lenin would get himself into. And so I do think that maybe you'd find somewhere between the two, some sort of centrist position between international versus national communism, or whatever you want to call Stalin's position on things. Stalin believed that basically the Soviet Union needed to get its own shit in order before we started, setting up, trying to push revolution across the world. And I do think that maybe you'd have more Cold War things in the early years of the Soviet Union that would be kind of what you would suspect coming out of Trotsky's government, things that would be sort of Cold War-ish, trying to push for, like, fund and secretly arm communist revolutions all around the world. I do think that you'd probably see that in the communist, or in Lenin's Soviet Union. So, 1920s, that's what I'm going to say is going to happen, right? That I think the main thing, okay, so like, to kind of rewind, because there's some people who've come in ever since. So in this alternate scenario, Lenin didn't have his stroke, and so Stalin never came to power, at least not at the same time. So Lenin doesn't have a stroke, and he is in control of the early Soviet Union. That being said, Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky would still be pretty high up people in his organization. And so I do think that the balance between what Lenin wants and what Trotsky wants and what Stalin wants would all kind of balance in a way. So when it comes to economics, I do think that there would be a sort of less harsh but still very planned and centralized economy, just without the exact 5-year plan business that Stalin was so infamous for. Especially because you see the whole thing with with Lenin being much more pro, like, trying to transition communism outside, or transition capitalism into communism. So you might see more some of our transitional forms of economics, like instead of having a flat-out straight situation of a planned economy, you might see sort of a mixed economy. You might see, like, crown corporations, which are a term we use in Canada anyway for corporations that are they're technically run by the government, but they are businesses that are, you can use those to sort of vote, or you can use those. They're not expected to make a profit, but they are run like businesses. I think that would probably be the first transitional form. The other thing that would probably be true is that the USSR would probably be a little bit more interventionist, which would mean that the USSR would probably fund more socialist revolutions in other countries, which means that groups like the socialist movement in Germany, for example, might have a bit more funding and weaponry and things like that, which might, and obviously their support for things like the revolution in Spain would probably still happen, and if not, they would dedicate even more resources to it. So that's like the first things. Now, the next step I do think that would happen here is that Stalin would still be power hungry, and I do think that Trotsky would still be frustrated with how slow the process is moving. And so the next thing that I think we should probably say here, that I would suspect anyway, is that there would definitely one thing that would be immensely useful for the Soviet Union is that Stalin would probably, or Lenin would probably put a little bit more work into actually setting up, see you later, Cryptosporidium, setting up an actual government. Because by the time when Lenin died, Stalin's come to power is marked by very bloody purge where basically, because Stalin was an insane megalomaniac, he started killing everybody who had any sort of disagreements with him. Lenin would probably do less of that. So Lenin's government would have a lot more rivals and would have a lot more diversity in thought. You might have everything ranging from like democratic socialists all the way to like, you know, Trotsky and Stalin. So in early Soviet, so the Soviet Union would probably be a lot more ideologically diverse. They'd probably all still be socialists in some form or another, but there'd be a lot more different ideas at the table. And Stalin, and I do think that Lenin would probably try to set up some sort of institution in the Soviet Union to keep everything managed, you know, some sort of more, you know, less direct control, less of a dictatorship. We shall, you know, just a guess. But Stalin would probably still be a very powerful player in this system and probably be a strong voice for a faction in that government that would advocate for a stronger industrialization and a more domestic focus in economics and a much more authoritarian form of communism, while like Trotsky would be more like, you know, a war hawk, and they would all be vying for power. And I do think that even after the revolution was over, with Lenin at least being a because he was the face of the revolution, because he was this like figurehead, he could probably make the Soviet Union a lot more stable in its early years, which would mean way fewer people would be killed in the purges, and so you'd have a lot more diversity in ideas. So that's the one that I would think of. So then think about this on the world stage. The entire world was against the Soviet Union. I don't think that would change. I think that the fear of socialism would still be a huge impact. I do think that the 20s would still have an intense Red Scare. I do think that some people, like, for example, Emma Goldman was... she was deported from the United States during the Palmer raids, so in 1919, and then she got kind of despondent with the Soviet Union and left. I don't know if she left before she died, before Lenin died, though. If someone can look that up, that'd be interesting. It'd be interesting to see if, like, maybe if Lenin kept more ideological diversity, that the anarchists would be less angry and would be more of a player in this system, but who knows. And eventually, I do think that as things started doing well, they probably wouldn't do as well as things like as Stalin did, because Stalin's sort of forced revitalization of the economy led to huge economic growth in the 1920s and the 1930s. And so I think that would be muted a little bit, but it would still be pretty successful. And the idea that it's more ideological diverse, there's less like divisions between the like once Stalin becomes a figure in the international left, so Emma Goldman was still gone by this point, so never mind. But like once, like there's this whole like division that happens in the international left between those who support the USSR and those who disagree with the USSR, especially with Stalinism. And I do think that that would be the next thing we need to discuss, is that maybe with Lenin's more ambiguous position on some of these things, that you would see less open fighting happening in the in these circles, which would mean that there'd probably be a lot more, probably a lot more unity in the left. So with the more tacit support from the Soviet Union and more unity in different factions around the world, you'd probably see a stronger, more resurgent left in the 20s and 30s, which would be very interesting because, as you guys know, the Depression would still happen, and the Depression would probably be quite interesting if there was this successful example of the Soviet Union that probably had it'd probably be a democracy, but like not a multi-party democracy. So it'd be like a single party country, so you'd be voting for people, but they wouldn't be kind of like how things are in China. But like with a more unified left like that, I think that there would probably be a lot of interesting debates, and I do think that you might see more socialist leanings happen in countries where socialism did really well but didn't quite take over. And so I would actually think that in the Depression, you might see less of the revanchist radical right show up if there is a viable alternative in the left that can be more vocal and less oppressed. So, like, I would think that one of the first things you'd probably see, this might actually, if you think about it, this might actually be the end of World War II. Because I would think that in the countries that became fascist, specifically Germany and Italy, you could probably guess that that things would change, because Italy and Germany both had pretty strong socialist movements that the fascists had to brutally repress. Maybe less in Italy, but definitely in Germany. And so maybe, just maybe, with Lenin in power, with a stronger left, see you later, 255, take care. With a stronger left, maybe you would actually see Germany become a socialist country rather than a fascist dictatorship. Like, maybe Hitler doesn't come to power. Maybe. The Weimar Republic was a very weak country, and if it had crumbled, maybe the alternative of turning to a communist movement or versus a fascist movement, like if I remember, okay, like Hitler was put in power in Germany because they had the positive example of Italy, and they had there's sort of this deal made so that conservatives could get to power, and they had the long-term goal of trying to get the monarchy back in charge. So I would imagine that if, in that case, in the Weimar Republic, you might end up with some sort of division between the communists and the fascists, but the communists would have a little bit more power, so what would happen is you might end up with, like, an actual, maybe German civil war, similar to, like, what happens in Spain. So, like, you might end up, before the Spanish Civil War, having a German civil war between, let's just, like, make it easy and just say East Germany versus West Germany. And you have this sort of Cold War going on, and instead of fascists sending resources in on one side and the communists sending in resources on the other, you might have, like, the liberal capitalist countries giving resources in the West and socialist countries giving in resources in the East. And in that case, because of everybody's, like, war weariness that kind of led to all those capitulations to Hitler, I actually could see in that case the socialists winning in Germany and Germany becoming a communist country, which would scare the ever-living shit out of the West. As far as Italy goes, Italy would be a much more interesting thing. I'm not sure how strong Italian socialism was. I know it was pretty strong, but I think that this might not have worked out the same way. Let's just say for example, just to make things fun, that communism doesn't really take hold in Italy, and that maybe you do end up with fascism in Italy still. So you'd have Mussolini, but you wouldn't have Hitler. That would be interesting. And then I think you would still end up having, because the divisions that led to Italian fascism weren't really brought about by the threat of communism I think you'd probably still end up seeing, like, a lot. It would be like this Cold War that would happen early, because the Soviet Union would be a lot more aggressive in its, like, interventions. And you have these communist movements that weren't able to succeed in their countries, but would be closer to becoming successful because they would have more support from the USSR, and because the Liberal Democrats are, without fascists to sort of start this domino, the Liberal Democrats would probably have less effort, like would probably do less effort to prop it up. So I could easily see a fascist Italy that is sort of allies with the Liberal Democrats. And then when you go to Spain, when it comes to Spain, you would have the Spanish Civil War happening between the socialists and the sort of royalists, which would become but we consider like the royalist side of the Spanish Civil War fascist because of all the support that they got from Italy and from Germany. In this case, I would probably say that you'd end up with hey, Michael Collins, you'd probably end up with a Spanish Civil War that would be between leftist forces, the leftist Republicans, and a monarchist government, the sort of the Franco government. Although Franco was a dictator, he wasn't the king, but the king supported Franco, and Franco supported the king, so that's why I said monarchist. But you probably end up with a right-wing dictator government that'd be propped up by the Italians and with liberal democratic support. So like the Americans and the British would by and large be fighting for the fascists in Spain, while the Soviets and the Germans, because remember in this scenario the Germans are now socialists, depending upon how bloody that war is, the Germans might be able to help out, but I really highly doubt it. And so it'd be like the Soviet Union versus Italy, Britain, and America. And so you end up with this situation like where, depending upon, because like it really depends upon how much German support really tipped the battle in the favor of Spain, which would be a very good question because I don't know. We'll get to the Pacific a little bit later because I do think that might be interesting as well. So I don't know. I'm going to leave it to the chat for you guys to say, like, in this situation, in this scenario where the Spanish Civil War is still happening, and you have a very war drawn on the same lines, except that the Germans are a kind of war-weary socialist country because they had a civil war just a few years earlier, or a civil war still going on. And you have Italy, which is fascist, but is allied with the Western capitalist countries. And then you have Britain and America sort of giving weak support to the fascists. Where do you see that going? Where do you see that war ending up? Who wins? Because the Soviet Union is very powerful, and the Soviet Union would probably care more, but the Soviet Union probably also would have invested a lot of their resources in this German Civil War that would be happening at the same time. And very curious. But I also imagine that, we'll get into that kind of stuff later. But it'd be interesting to know where we would go from there. And then I think that when you get to and then also the Soviet Union would probably not do things like the invasion of Finland. They probably wouldn't have agreed with the invasion of Poland. Those kinds of things. I think that a lot of those countries would probably not get involved in a lot of these things. Like a lot of the countries that were newly made after the Treaty of Versailles would probably be more neutral. Things like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland. The USSR might have a deal with Poland for moving things. There might be this sort of little highway that goes through. But I don't know enough about Polish politics in that period to really know where they would go in this whole thing. But it's an interesting aspect. Sorry if I'm getting into the nitty-gritty of things. As far as in Japan, I think that a lot of things don't change that much. I think that one thing you might see, depending upon how the resources of the Soviet Union are, that the Soviet Union might get, because they would be a little bit more internationalist, they might be a little bit more involved with the Chinese communists against the Kuomintang, or the Kuomintang, sorry. So Mao would have a lot more direct support from the Soviet Union during that war. But Japan, like the Meiji period would have still happened, and the Japanese would have still defeated the Russians in the war in the 1890s. And so I do think that World War II in the Pacific plays out pretty much the same. Like, I do think that you'd probably end up with a Pacific-focused war there, where Japan is invading China and Britain, and the only thing I could think that might be interesting is that Britain and the USSR would probably be on opposite sides of a lot of conflicts going on in Europe, and I don't know how that would translate to their support of for the Chinese and the Japanese in the Pacific, because I could very much see. Because, like, the Japanese started rolling over everybody's colonies, and that's why everybody got mad. And so I do see the Japanese as maybe, and because they're imperial, I do think that Japan will still probably do the whole co-prosperity sphere thing. So maybe what you see, is that you see Britain focusing on maintaining its colonies. So Britain's fighting Japan only in the places where Japan is moving into British colonies. So, and Australian colonies and things like that. Because I believe didn't the Japanese conquer like New Guinea or something, which was Australian at that time? I'm trying to remember, trying to recall off the top of my head. But like, you can definitely see the Chinese, the Japanese fighting the people who have imperial colonies. Oh, Korea was an anarchist confederation. Oh yeah, that's the autonomous Shinmin region or something like that, right? So yeah, I think that maybe the Soviet Union would be fighting the Japanese in one area. So maybe Japan would just be sort of this country on its own, fighting against the Chinese, and then in the Chinese, like, I think that it's still like the what's it called, when the nationalists and the Soviet, or the nationalists and the communists, put aside their differences to fight the Japanese, maybe that would have still happened, but you'd have like the Soviets supporting the communists, and you'd have the capitalists supporting the nationalists, and so it's like this sort of war going on at the same time, which might be interesting. So what I really see here is, this is sort of my thesis about World War II in general, is that there's two separate wars going on at the same time. So you've got Japan fighting against this like sort of government fighting thing, and then you've got a Western Europe. You've got like this, I don't know if World War II would have broken out over this, but you'd have this Western Europe where you have this sort of alliance of Western capitalist countries with fascist Italy against a communist-leaning civil war in Germany, and a, let's say, communist-leaning war in Spain. And then maybe in France you have also a similar thing propping up. So like Western Europe becomes like the battleground of World War II between sort of this Soviet force and this growing international communist force versus the power of like this like proxy war, almost like a very low butane war, sort of like the Spanish Civil War, but happening in like 3 countries at the same time. And how that turns out, I have no idea. I imagine, though, whatever the piece of that war would be would result in all sorts of interesting things happening. Because I imagine that if a lot of those wars turn out to be victories for the communists, that you'd have like this communist mainland Europe versus like other places. But it would be very much like a Cold War coming early. Meanwhile, in Asia, you'd probably have this sort of weird proxy war going on between the Chinese and the Japanese, with the Soviets backing one faction and the West backing the other faction. It'd be interesting. It would almost be like, I don't know about Jacob, it'd be really confusing. I think that it would be like a lot of like trying to figure out like taking over railroad lines and highways and things like that. Like it would like the geography of that war would be so weird and odd to see, but yeah. I do think that the Red Scare would probably be the same level of severity, but I think that people would buy into it less because the Soviet Union would have had fewer stories about kangaroo courts and the purges to scare people with. And so I think that there'd be fewer people to fight against it. All right. But yeah, I do think that at the end you end up with a Cold War, or at the end of it, I think you end up with, depending upon how those wars shake out, a much diminished Soviet presence in Europe, or a much greater one. But the Cold War lines, like I don't think that this, like in this war scenario, the U.S. might get involved, but the U.S. might only get involved with like the Pacific Theater, and they don't really care about what's going on in Europe, which would be really interesting. Because then maybe the whole dynamic of the U.S. versus the USSR just doesn't become a thing. Because the Japanese, yeah, I do think that maybe Pearl Harbor would have still happened because that was due to them being desperate for resources. But you wouldn't have Germany declaring war on America and America getting involved in Europe. And so maybe international communism would succeed because you might end up with Britain and maybe France being the only Western powers fighting against these encroaching communist movements in all these countries. I think that it would very much be like a chaotic civil war going on in like several countries in Europe. Be like kind of like the 1848 rebellions or something like that. And how those countries shake up, I don't know. And yeah, and then you have a World War II in Europe, or sorry, in Asia that looks maybe with a little bit more resources. The Soviet Union may be a little bit more involved, but very much similar to how it played out in the actual World War II. That would also, yeah, the Final Destination theory would be good too. I do think that also we also don't need to rule out that Lenin might be couped by Stalin, and Stalin might like actually like take over the government in a coup or something like that. It's not outside the realm possibility. I should go into my bag and grab a dice and roll it to see who wins in those countries. But I think that's good enough. I think that's enough for that one scenario. That was really interesting. So we end up with the Cold War coming early. Basically, no strong hold for European fascism. Like fascism really doesn't take off in a big way, and you still have a Asian front that seems pretty much the same. My cat is planning something. Are you? She seems fine. All right. Let's see how the poll has gone. Let's go with the next one. So the next one we got here is... Ooh, okay. Somebody said they wanted to see their polytheism one right before they went to bed, because it's tied for second, so... Let's do, yeah. That's a fun one, though. I think that it shows, I think that alternate history, though, shows that the Soviet Union really zagged when it should have zigged in that period, and that the weakness of the Soviet Union to get involved in the world sort of is responsible for a lot of the or at least partially responsible for the rise in fascism and the sort of weakness of socialist movements in other places. All right, I see that there's some new people, so I'm going to link the straw poll again for you guys. There you go. So I do see highest up. Let's do what if polytheism remained popular. I think that we could get something out of that. That's not. I think that one wouldn't take too long, because I think that this shows up in a lot of the Alternate History Hub videos too, which is that if you have a scenario that happens very far back, that you wind up with a lot of like if you have a religion that, or you have stuff that goes really far back, you wind up with such a fundamentally unrecognizable modern age that it's really hard to project too far out. So, hey Holden, we're just talking. People are giving me some alternate history prompts, and we're talking through alternate history scenarios. If you want to hold on to your scenario, I mean, we already have a whole bunch. I imagine that maybe we can do some more maybe on a future episode, since you guys seem to like this so much. So we just finished doing a scenario. What if Vladimir Lenin didn't have a stroke in 1924, and the Soviet Union continued under his leadership for at least a few more decades? But the next one we're going to talk about is what if polytheism survived? And I think that there is a really good point of divergence to put in here. So one thing, Cyrus. So one thing that happened in the deep annals of history is that the people of Judea, the early Hebrews, the early Jews, were pushed into they were exiled from their homeland, and they wound up in the Persian Empire. And there was a emperor of Persia named Cyrus the Great, who basically embraced religious pluralism and like embraced the Jewish people and let them be part of his empire, and sort of when they pushed into Judea, gave the Jews back their land. And he's put in a very honored place in the Torah and the Old Testament of the Bible. And so that's why Cyrus is considered like this. I think he's the only non-Jew who has some very special title in Judaism, but is because he basically protected these people. So what if he didn't? What if Cyrus didn't protect the Jewish people, and they weren't able to keep themselves together cohesively, and they sort of just assimilated into a bigger Persian Empire? And so really the seeds of Abrahamic religion die there. Interesting. So there's a few there's a lot of ways that you could go on with this. Can you do the socialist revolutionary scenario? Well, we'll see what goes up after that. We'll see what's next on the list. I have to follow democracy, people. So what's some differences between... So really, a lot of the polytheistic religions keep themselves going, even without... there's no Christianity, there's no Judaism, no Islam. So what happens? I would say that, first of all, the Persian religion, I guess like the Zoroastrian religion, would probably become the dominant religion in the Middle East, at least in that part of the Middle East. Without Judaism and without Islam, Zoroastrianism is really the religion that was like filling that area. You'd probably see a keeping of things like the old Egyptian religion. You probably would have seen a lot of syncretism happening between the different powerful polytheistic faiths in the Mediterranean. Like, even by the end of the polytheistic days of the Roman Empire, you saw that like they were starting to integrate Egyptian gods, and you were starting to see like powerful, like you were seeing that in Greece too with Hermubus, I don't know. It was like Hermes and Anubis mixed together into one god, and started to see more things like that. I do think that the Roman Empire would definitely spread its gods around, because in polytheistic societies, when you when somebody takes you over or when somebody's religion shows up, you don't need to necessarily abandon your gods. You can just add some of theirs to your pantheon. And so you'd probably see, as technology got better, as the ability to travel and trade and everything moved up, and the Roman Empire started to unify things and stuck around a little bit longer, that you'd find polytheism becoming much more... Hermanubis or something like that, I think was his name. You start to see this like more mishmashed religious world going on, this Mediterranean religion. That would be the sort of mix of Greek and Roman and Zoroastrian and Egyptian religions sort of all playing with each other. And so you'd probably see, it'd be pretty interesting to watch. I think that, like...
Hello!
Hey, look, it happened again.
See, I feel like I started a precedent now.
Yeah.
If I don't, you're all going to judge me.
They asked when you were going to come with seltzer water.
Predictable. That's what you get in me.
So we're doing alternate history scenarios.
I've been listening.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, I
So
was listening on the streetcar.
So what do you think?
Yeah, I think I heard most of Lenin.
Oh yeah, that one.
That's all I really heard.
We're done with that one now.
Yeah.
We're doing polytheism now.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, Hermanubis is definitely like the he's the god of the furries.
The god of the furries.
He's Hermes with Anubis's head.
Oh.
Yeah. So,
All right, I'll let you guys get back to
yeah.
it.
Did you know that people still practice polytheism to this very day? Yes, I know they do. That happens all over the place, especially in this country called India. I've heard about a couple times. So I still think that the Roman Empire would have collapsed, because the Roman Empire didn't collapse due to Christianity. It collapsed due to all sorts of other factors that happened way before there were Christians. So I would say that you probably see all sorts of weird mixed religions show up all over the Middle East. And sociologically and like politically, I guess, like the Abrahamic religions, because they have such a monopolistic idea on what reality should be like, they're much less accepting of other people. So I do imagine that in a future where the Abrahamic religions just don't take off, that you see a Europe and North Africa and Middle East that has way more religious diversity. On top of that, you'd probably see a similar amount of conflict. I don't think that would change very much. I don't think that the Abrahamic approach to war is much different than any other. And I do think that similar, like life changes in a similar way just because different types of faiths take off. I do think that in many ways we'd probably have similar like culture would still be fairly similar to the way it is today. Just we'd have a lot of different, we'd have a lot more different religions. We'd probably be a lot less bigoted in that sense. We would know that we would be living alongside a lot of people who had different faiths than us. And also we wouldn't be fully against the idea of people not having religious belief and not accepting or rejecting different gods. And I imagine that once you got to like today, I imagine if you got to today, you'd end up with a situation where the gods would be like, if people do follow religion, they would be a lot more, how should I say it? They'd be a lot more personal. Like, I imagine that polytheism, if it like, well, I mean, like, you can like look at groups like the Hindu. You could probably be very much like how Hindu society works in India. There are lots of gods. Some are more important than others. Which gods are more important than others sometimes is up to the individual, or different types of society. So, however that goes. You'd still see fanatical cults. Not cults in like the sense of like, like Heaven's Gate or something, but you'd see cults like groups that are not necessarily monotheistic, but dedicate their efforts towards one god. like the god, like the cult of Jupiter or something that would like be like, yeah, we're all about Jupiter. We're the Jupiter fan club right here. All hail Jupiter. But like, it's not like they deny that other gods exist. What I do think is that Christianity not coming to Europe would be very interesting for the future of Europe after the Roman Empire collapses. There's some people who think that like the Dark Ages wouldn't have happened because of Christianity, and I do think that that would have been blunted a little bit because of the whole heretical knowledge thing. But I do think that there would still be a sort of technological collapse after the Roman Empire starts to fall apart. And also, but the thing is, without Christianity, I think that it takes a lot longer for Europe to get back on its feet. Like Europe didn't have the Pope, and they wouldn't have the Church to sort of get things going again. And so you'd probably, if you had anybody bring any sort of European like life back together, it would be based on the idea of the Roman Empire rather than like the idea of like the Church and everything like that. And where that goes, I have no idea. I think that like that's where really my predictive powers can stop, because without Christianity, without Islam, like who knows what happens to these religions afterwards? Who knows of the people who are born and die and are able to do this or that? Like, so many variables have changed by this point that it'd be nearly impossible to really have an idea of what would happen, about where things would go. Because people who would have never been born in our timeline might start new religions, they might rediscover things, they might invent new things, and all of a sudden things have gotten really funky and strange. But I think but it still shows that there are some things about monotheism and polytheism that would shape the way things work, especially when it comes to centralization and motivating people to large religious causes. Like without pilgrimages, without crusades, without jihads, you see a much less united Mediterranean world, which I think would be very different. Whew. All right, let's see. The other one we have here is, what if Reconstruction, let me find this. What if Reconstruction fundamentally altered the culture of the South and stomped out previous white landed noble class? Okay. This is fun. All right. So what if we wound up in a situation where, so all right. Let's move away from the classical world and let's move ourselves more in the direction of the end of the American Civil War. Hello, Potion M. Thank you for hoping that I'm doing great. Yeah, so let's talk about Reconstruction. So this can kind of be paired. Let's pair two of these ideas together, because there was another idea that someone said where what if Abraham Lincoln wasn't assassinated and Reconstruction was completed? And so these two ideas are very similar. So let's kind of take them both together, because I'm trying to think about like how would a radical Reconstruction happen, and what if yeah, so what if radical Reconstruction happened, and what if we didn't see, and Abraham Lincoln wasn't killed? So John Wilkes Booth, I don't know, trips on his way to Ford's Theater, cracks his neck or something, passes away, or something else happens, and John Wilkes Booth just doesn't assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Maybe the entire attack against Abraham Lincoln's most senior officials just doesn't happen. So this was not too long after the building of what's it called, of the 13th Amendment. So slavery is outlawed, and in our timeline, Abraham Lincoln's successor was Andrew Johnson, who was way more kind and lenient to the Southern aristocracy. I do think what would happen in this situation, this sort of feels like, how come you, Cody's brother, and Fur Baby don't kick it no more? We were trying. It's just that, it's all dependent on Cody. It's all dependent on his schedule, so we have to see. So Reconstruction will happen in the South in a much more aggressive fashion. You'd see more of the... what would you call it? You'd see the South... first of all, the big thing would be land appropriation. So the large plantations of the South that belong to white aristocracy would be demolished. Because we're gonna mix these two scenarios. If you're talking about So That Happened, we stopped doing the show for a while because Cody was too busy with his book. And now that his book is nearing completion, we're trying to get it started again. And we've tried a couple times, but we couldn't get all three of us together at the same time. So we're working on it. When it happens, it'll happen. It just won't happen this weekend because it's Thanksgiving for me. Anyways, so in this South, let's just say that, like, the position, like, Abraham Lincoln puts in all sorts of people. Like, I imagine that even if Abraham Lincoln wasn't assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, that there would probably be a couple assassination attempts. And let's say that, like, there's some unsuccessful ones, and it really starts pissing Lincoln off. The South is being so angry and revanchist that he decides to go way more hardcore on the South. So the South, after the Civil War, was under, I think it was about 10 military jurisdictions. And they were in the process of trying to... Thanksgiving is in October in Canada, Michael. They're trying to get... So they're trying to reintegrate these states back into the Union. And I do think that with the guerrilla warfare and the high maintenance that a lot of the Southern aristocracy are being, you're just not going to allow, like, that's just not going to happen. Like, they're going to say, like, yeah, we're going to demolish these things and we're going to build a land of the South that is based on free land and free people and freedom of everything. And so, all the stuff that Tommy Lee Jones said in Lincoln. And so I imagine the easiest way to do that is that they would take the slavery plantations and they would demolish the house, or they would remove the house, and then they would split up the property amongst the families of the former slaves that lived there. Or you could go the General Sherman route, which was the 40 acres and a mule thing, where the government literally takes the entire South and just starts, I guess, like, you can actually see this because the Americans really did this when they moved out west. So maybe they, like, take the South, they break up all the plantations and just, like, grid the entire South, and then they start saying, like, all right, if you come, like, the whole Homestead Act, if you come to us with, like, for like $1 or something like that, you will be given a parcel of land to grow stuff on. And maybe it's done in a haphazard fashion, so it overlaps actual plantations. So you end up with, like, people, a discrepancy between people who just get, like, raw wasteland and some people who get, like, a quarter of, like, a old tobacco farm or something like that. And you would have, like, these states where you have, they maybe, like, even make, like, a constitutional amendment that say, like, you can't even discriminate who gets these parcels based on race, because there was some really forward-thinking racial ideas that were going on in, like, Reconstruction South. So you end up with, states having black governors, and you have lots of former slaves getting appropriated land, because if you think about the population distribution of the South, they can say, like, if you lived in the former Confederacy, you're entitled to a parcel of land. You will get one parcel of land, no more, no less. Your state is not going to practice slavery. It's not going to practice any sort of, the black codes are not going to be a thing. The Jim Crow laws are not going to be a thing because everybody's going to be able to vote. So maybe, yeah, you grid the South and you just start giving it to everybody. And because of the population distribution, that would mean that every state in the South would be, I think almost every state in the South would be majority African American. And so you would have part of the country that is, politically anyways, dominated by black people. I think that you end up with southern states that are hardcore Republican states for a long time. Probably until, like, Southern strategy, if that is even a thing that happens. You have a lot of former fancy like slave owners losing their entire life's fortune, which I think would mean that you would have an even stronger white backlash against this movement. So you probably would see a lot of the richer Southerners sort of packing up their stuff and either leaving America or leaving the South. So I think that you'd have a lot of those former slave aristocracy, instead of like getting a plot of land and trying to grow stuff, moving to like the North and trying to like restart their life with like their, their possessions and stuff like that. And then you would probably also see out west, yeah, like you could probably see the West being very different, or the West. You could see a lot of people who were cheated out of their parcel of land, or their parcel of land sucked, moving out west later. But because of the sort of large-scale land distribution, you probably see a lot of people either moving west or as we're seeing here, yeah, you can see David's kind of saying, like, you'd see a lot of people moving north, especially a lot of white people who used to be rich. Because if you think about it, if they decided to just go with, like, the straight equal land redistribution, there was a lot of landless white people who lived in the former Confederate states who would be given land that they had never had before. Like, the thing about the South and the slave economy is that it not only resulted in a like aristocratic sort of situation, but it resulted in a lot of white dirt farmers who really did not have much property to call their own, and there weren't really many prospects for them, no way for them to move up in the world. I think a lot of their racial animosity and stuff like that might have been tempered if, one generation later they were at least given a plot of land, which is something that they wouldn't have had before. But I do think that a lot of the wealthy Southern aristocracy would definitely have moved to the North. I think that a lot of them would have probably moved into cities and become like, fancy rich families. Or they would have moved out west to try and start something else up. Because I do think that the Western expansion would not have been very differently, except that you'd have a lot more former Southerners and maybe a few more black people going. As far as what happens in the South, I think that you could see like racial tensions going, being a lot more. I think you could see like racial disparity being a lot less intense, because you don't have a lot of black people after the Civil War like having to move up north and restart their life with nothing. They would have states that were run by them, and they would all have plots of land. If they were all given their promised like 40 acres and a mule. I'm sure some rich Southerners would leave the country, probably to Canada, which would suck for us. But yeah, a lot of them would either choose to leave the country, or they would probably leave the South. So it'd be a lot of the money would come out. But then, given the fact that there's like a lot of farms and stuff like that, like It would probably be, they would not be rich states, but they would be states that were, you know, a lot freer. But maybe you don't see, like, the long-term success of the Ku Klux Klan or things like that. Like, if you don't have that, what's that thing called? Resource, like resource threat or something like that. If you don't have people who are worried about these things, maybe these things would change. I don't know. Yeah, I did forget that a lot of Confederates went to Brazil instead of Canada. So yeah, you could see like South Africa, Brazil, Canada. I think these would all be places that fancy Confederate people could go to. I mean, like, in Brazil, they were still practicing slavery, so I mean, that would help for them, I think. Yeah, you'd probably see a larger crackdown on the KKK. And would the Southern economy have caught up sooner? That's a good question. So, like, without sharecropping, this would really be like whether or not sharecropping would be a thing. One of the things I think the South didn't really take off economically until, weirdly enough, until the invention of air conditioners. So for a long time, the South was pretty poor and pretty rural because the South took a big hit after the Civil War due to the fact that with the lack of trade with the South, a lot of the European powers started to shift their cotton necessities from trading with the South to Egypt and India. So the price of cotton went way down after the Civil War was over. So I imagine that you'd probably see a lot more. It would start with like subsistence farming, and then probably, who knows if industrialization would have happened at this. It probably happened around the same time. Like, until the air conditioner was invented, you really aren't going to have a powerful Southern economy. But you would have probably there'd be a situation where you'd have a lot of these a lot of black politicians in the South, which would have a lot of representation, which would mean that a lot of the things like black codes and Jim Crow laws would not be able to happen. And you would also have a bigger federal crackdown on hate groups and on groups like the KKK. And I do think that, yeah, I guess you could say that there would be a lot of agricultural development, but this is the industrial age. Like, I don't think that you would see a lot of really wealthy people. If you'd see, like, the big economic disparity would be the quality of the land you got. Because I do imagine that a big project like this in the 19th century, with how they organized things, that people would not be getting, like, equally good parcels of land. People would end up with some, like, really crappy land. And some people would end up with, like, former plantations. And so they would have, like, already cultivated land. So I think that there'd be some disparity based on that. But I do think you see a South that's a lot less revanchist than it is today. Yeah. I'm very sorry that... Oh. Hello, Darth Kilhoun. Thank you for the super chat. What about an alternate history about where President Hindenburg brought back the Kaiser and rearmed the third-party countries to his election? All right, that is a lot of German history that I am not privy to. I am very sorry, Darth Kilhoun. I know that you gave me $5, but I don't. It would be a disaster. I wouldn't be able to answer that. As far as politics, you would probably see, like, in the late 19th century, you saw, like, Republican domination of American politics, and that would probably be even stronger. Maybe to the point where after the Civil War, the Democratic Party collapses and there's no Democratic Party, and that maybe instead of a Democratic Party, you see something like a populist party show up in the late 19th century, because that was like the next big movement that would have happened afterwards. And so you'd probably see like this like pro-tariff, adding silver to the money supply, like very like left-wing populist party. But I do think that that would be at the end of a few decades where there might not be functionally a second party, and the Republican Party is basically running the country, which would be really weird. Because I could see if you like if you had like radical Reconstruction in the South, I could see the Democratic Party being just destroyed. Like, where would it go? What would its base be? And in the Populist Party, which would be a very left-wing party, not like populism like Donald Trump populism, but this is like anti-capitalist, anti-internationalism, sort of pro-farmer, pro-immigrant party. I would be surprised if it was a full-on communist party, because communism really didn't take off in a meaningful way until the 20th century. But I could see that if everything else happened in the world in a similar fashion, then the Russian Revolution maybe will inspire more leftist allies. I do think that if there is a second party and it's more like the Populist Party, that you'd probably end up with more far left-wing politics in America, because you would have more of that support. So you'd probably see a much less right-wing America, which is funny, because it's me saying that there would be a history in which the Democratic Party would have phased out of existence, and that would be a more left-wing America, which is weird. But there you are. Yeah, that's a whole thing. I like this. We've done a couple alternate history scenarios, and all of them have been like, the world's slightly better than it is now. We really do live in the darkest of timelines, don't we? No. I actually find that in alternate history scenarios, a lot of the time, at least with Alternate History Hub, is like, a lot of the scenarios that Cody does are always like, the world is so much darker and bleaker than it is in our world. And they always want to go for like the darkest and worst things that could happen, like the Nazis winning World War II or the Confederacy getting independence or something like that. And it's like, yeah, man, that's bleak. But like, what if radical Reconstruction happened? And like, you see this America that's a lot more egalitarian, and where like the deep divisions based on a legacy of slavery have been like addressed somewhat. But, maybe justice actually can happen. It lets you think like, hey, maybe in the future we could do things differently. We need more optimistic alternate history. I agree. Thank you. Thank you, Matt Mitrovich. I should have gotten you, we should have done this as like a call or something. When I got this idea, I should have bugged you to be like my co-host for this. I can't do that now, sadly, but if you like this kind of stuff, you should definitely check out Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, who's in the chat. Because he's like a guy who predominantly reviews alternate history novels and talks about different scenarios in those books and stuff. Okay, let's see. Let's take a look at the maps. We did. What if socialist revolutionaries? Okay, there's a new biggest one now. Let's take a look at this. What if socialist revolutionaries took over Russia instead of the Bolsheviks? All right, we already did a Russian Revolution one, so I think we might, and it's kind of a similar idea, so let's pass on that one. What if America gained independence? Oh, this one sounds fun. What if America gained independence as a Commonwealth of Britain, similar to Canada? Okay. That's fun. Okay. I lost the chat. I'm looking for the chat. if Quebec rose up against Canada, they did. That actually did happen in history 2 times. There was 1856. There was the like the Patriots rose up against the Canadians and tried to become a Quebecois republic, and it failed. They tried again a couple years later, and I think it worked out even worse. And then they voted to separate from Canada in 1980 and in 1995, both times failing with a slight margin. So if like Quebec just like, I don't know, Quebec rising up against Canada right now would be kind of a tough, it'd be interesting to know, because like the military situation would be very interesting, because one thing that's really weird about Canada is that a lot of Quebecois people there's a lot, like, Quebecois people are overrepresented in the Canadian military to a pretty high extent, and also a lot of the biggest Canadian military bases are in Quebec. Now, that wouldn't guarantee that everybody would switch sides for that thing. I imagine that there's not a lot of support for Quebecois separation within the ranks of the Canadian military, but I'm sure there'd be a few. It'd be interesting, though, because all of the Canadian military, the core, anyways, of the Canadian military would be based out of the country that they are invading. But that would be a whole thing. If Quebec won, I think, if Quebec won the, like, 1856 rebellion, they would have become a republic. They might have been able to get recognition from France as, like, a way to, like, get revenge for the war that happened, like, 90 years ago. But people had longer memories back then, I think. I don't know. Quebec would have probably become sort of this federal republic and probably would have been pretty poor, because Quebec, a lot of Quebec's economic power comes from investments from, like, Scottish businessmen. So, like, you know, there would be a lot of, like, a lot of the investment that happened in Quebec happened not by French people, but by, like, Scottish and English people who moved to Quebec after the 7 Years' War. And I imagine a lot of that wealth would not stay if Quebec had, like, a French nationalist revolution that was successful. So really, like, they would be very hopefully trying to get America or France as their allies, or they'd be in very dire straits indeed. Thank you very much, Brennan Fletcher. I appreciate that. I'm always happy to receive praise, so don't worry about going off topic. But yeah, if there was like a mid-19th century French Republic in North America, it would be interesting to see what the Americans' response would be. I imagine that the British would try to retake it under as much as they possibly can, and they would be successful if the French were able to, if the Quebecois weren't able to make allies. But if they made allies with the Americans, maybe the British would not be so interested in trying to force to get back Quebec, or if they got France as an ally, they really wouldn't want to push on it. But that would remain to be seen. But that would be like the geopolitical situation, the biggest one, anyways. Let me see if I can get this other question out of the way. Or Radical Reviewer, thank you so much for the super chat. I'm just going to answer this question real quick, and then we'll move on to the scenario that you guys voted on. But they gave money. I have to give them something, because that doesn't happen very often. What if the Occupy movement lasted through the winter? I mean, the Occupy movement, its success was due to its I don't know if I'm like the believer that, like, are you gonna do another alternate history stream? Because I have some scenarios. If you guys liked this stream, then I will totally do another one, because I spend all week agonizing over what to do for the stream. So if you guys like this, I will totally do it again. But yeah, to get to the Occupy Wall Street thing, like, Occupy Wall Street didn't so much fall apart because of the winter. It fell apart because of the crackdown by Mayor Bloomberg. I do think that the Occupy did last through the winter and did a lot of really cool things, just not in New York. Like Occupy Oakland, as far as I know, Occupy Oakland is still around and still doing some pretty cool stuff. As far as the Occupy movement, like even when they got taken down by Bloomberg's, like bringing in like I wasn't attack helicopters, but he brought in helicopters and like people who looked like stormtroopers to clear out Zuccotti Park. And I think that even if they, lasted for a while, they would have still had mixed success. I think that the success that they did have, the success that Occupy did have was drastically reframing the conversation. Like Americans, like the idea of economic inequality as an issue, the idea of that the 1% is now a word in the American political vernacular is pretty impressive. And I think that we often say that Occupy Wall Street failed, but I think that it succeeded in reframing a lot of the way that Americans think about class. And I don't think that they get enough credit for that. But I do think that, if they were able to hang around longer, maybe they would have been able to stay more relevant. And it would be interesting to see what even more class consciousness would have been like. I don't know. Maybe would have gotten a certain old Jewish man from Vermont to be president right now, which would be a whole thing. But yeah, I don't think without Occupy Wall Street, you would not have had the success of the Bernie Sanders campaign. So yeah, I'm a big fan. All right, the other question that we got was, what if Canada got independence, what if America got its independence after the revolution, but it was like as sort of, or got its independence but got it as like a confederation, like kind of like how Canada became a dominion of Great Britain before it got its independence. That's really interesting because there's so many things to pick apart with that. First of all, the British Empire, like the American Revolution, is considered the end of the quote-unquote First British Empire. So like the point of divergence I guess we could go with is that there's some sort of like the war, like the American Revolution is cut short, and they win through some sort of compromise, and they get to become like this sort of more independent, but still like this sort of dominion. Like they practice the whole dominion thing earlier than with Canada. So America becomes the early dominion practice that would happen in our reality like 90 years later. So we'll just say that happens. So America, I don't even know what you would call it, the 13 colonies. Maybe each of them become their own dominion. Maybe you don't have like that unified government, because there was no guarantee that they would be one entity after the war. That was sort of a thing that they came together on later, but it could have been, they would have been 13 independent like dominions, their own little states, which would be really interesting. Because then, so like the things that they would probably gain in that is that, well, first of all, the British Empire would have stayed together much longer. The American Revolution was, like, even after the American Revolution was done, then after the American Revolution lasted longer than like the end of the American Revolution for the Americans. Like once the Americans, like the Battle of Yorktown, where the Americans like won the revolution, the war had by that point dragged in the Dutch and had dragged in the French, and so there was like the American Revolutionary War continued for quite a number of years after the Americans had gotten out, and it was mostly a war in the Caribbean between the British and the Dutch and the French. The British-American Commonwealth, I like it. Or the Dominion of Columbia. Ooh, that's a nice fancy one. So a couple things. I think that, first of all, America wouldn't have expanded west as fast because there would have been, one, no Louisiana Purchase. But two, one of the things that the British were insistent upon because of the Quebec Act and because of the Pontiac's Rebellion was that the British were restricting expansion into the Ohio Valley. So maybe you end up in this situation where you see this like back and forth of like of tension between like this new Colombian republic or this Colombian dominion to fight or fighting with the British over like what they're going to do about this expansion west. And I think it'd be a lot slower. And with the Louisiana Purchase, I'm trying to think if anybody else would buy it. Like, I'm not sure who France would sell it to. I'm sure they'd sell it to somebody. Well, the Louisiana Purchase was sold to the United States to President Thomas Jefferson. So, like, if the United States is not really independent, I'm not sure if the British would let them take on all that territory without their permission. Maybe they would. But you most definitely, like, Thomas Jefferson would not have anything in this. If there is, I imagine that any American Revolution that ended this way would probably not have Thomas Jefferson being an important player in that. But then Thomas Jefferson was really close with the French. So I feel like you needed Thomas Jefferson and his relationship with the French in order to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. And yeah, selling Louisiana to like their biggest rival would probably be a big thing. Spain would probably buy it. Maybe, yeah, you'd probably see an America that doesn't really move west all that much. And then you'd probably see a larger, Spain making the purchase, and you'd probably still have the Napoleonic era, like Latin American Revolution. So maybe you have like another country that is like based out of Louisiana, that's like the Spanish-speaking country of Louisiana, or it becomes part of Mexico, and Mexico becomes this gigantic country, which would be very interesting. Actually, given all that, I'd probably say by modern day, Mexico would probably be an economic superpower. But then, with as probably Matt would say here, like that feels like Mexico. I'm just turning Mexico into a space-filling empire at that point. But I'm sure that a country that is that big would probably split up in a bunch of ways. Like, I'm sure that Louisiana would probably not stay independent. It would probably like have an independence revolution, very much like the rest of Latin America did in the early 19th century, who was part of the Spanish Empire. So I imagine that Louisiana would be a country, and it would be made up of pretty much like the Mississippi, like the whole Mississippi River, like up probably to like Michigan, which would be pretty cool. I wonder what that country would be like. I'm sure its capital would be New Orleans. So just fill in the blanks however you would like about what a country that is where its capital is in New Orleans or Baton Rouge or whatever. See you later, Luke Lee. Have fun at work. Yeah, there wouldn't be a Texas revolt because there would probably be there'd be no Texans, like no Americans moving to Texas. So the Tejanos would still keep it up for themselves. Yeah, you'd see a very different America in that sense. Okay, so there would still probably be some movement west. I wonder, though, if it would clash with this, like, Louisiana thing. I wonder how that would go down. Maybe the British would... Maybe there'd be, like, the war against... I don't know, probably be called, like, the War of 1818. And the British would go to war with Louisiana, and maybe they would take it over. But I don't think you probably would see America to the side. I missed your super... I did not miss your super chat. I was just trying to finish this line of reasoning between you get it. So what if Canada and Quebec also joined USA against UK? Okay, So this is like a kind of spin on the American Revolution situation, in which what if like Canada got involved in that war as well? Well, that is a very different war indeed, because an American Revolution where Canada gets involved and Quebec gets involved would be a war in which the British would have no chance, because the reasons why the British were able to even manage any real war at all in the Americas is because they had Halifax Harbor as a point where they could do logistics. I mean, actually, for most of the war, they also had New York City for most of the American Revolution, so there was that too. But without Halifax Harbor to sort of be that place for them to do stuff, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like the war would probably go very much the same. It's just that the British would probably lose earlier, because Canada didn't have a whole lot of people in it back then. And it'd be interesting to see what an early American republic trying to deal with a province in the north that is made up of gasp French, gasp Catholics as part of their like politics. I imagine it would work. It would just be it would change the color of early America. It would be much harder for slavery would become a big issue, because Canada was the end of the Underground Railroad for a lot of years. So that would be interesting. There'd be no War of 1812. But New York was only taken because they moved from Halifax. So yeah. There'd be like a whole lot of interesting directions to go with that. I'm not sure what would happen afterwards. That would be a huge new United States of America, and poised to have a lot of resource wealth, with Canada on board as well. That's a pretty big deal. I realize I'm not even using this like text thing, so maybe I'll just take up the whole camera instead of doing that whole thing. Let me just do it real quick. Just taking care of business real quick. There we go. All right. Yeah, you probably have more enslaved people, instead of like running away to Canada, running to like these, I'm trying to think what they were called, but like these sort of rural areas where colonists hadn't gotten to yet, and sort of settling in these like out of the way locations, trying to make these small communities for themselves. A lot of them happened in America and like Florida. Like a lot of slaves escaped into Florida and started living with the living with the Seminole people in Florida. And that was partially the reason why Andrew Jackson invaded Florida. Which would be pretty cool. So yeah, you probably see more pockets of escaped slaves moving out west. Mexico outlawed slavery way before America, so maybe you'd see a lot of maybe you'd see the Underground Railroad being Mexico, and lots of slaves running to Mexico. Yes, my name is Tristan. I mean, the Underground Railroad ran from the south all the way to the border with Canada, so, same distance, you just go west and you'd end up in Mexico. Yeah, that'd be really interesting. I'm not sure how that would go, but yeah, the dynamics would be very different. That, like, whole, like, U.S., Quebec, Canada merger would be a huge United States. What's it called? The 16 states or whatever, call it. An independent African and Native American Florida is a cool idea. Yeah, because Florida was Spanish until. I actually don't know the real story about how Florida became an American state. A lot of times these things just kind of happen. Hi, racist. What's up? Okay. I'm Sara Mina Torres. I don't know what you're talking about. Anyways, maybe you always just hear the story about like how Florida just sort of. I'm sure there's. It's kind of early in American history for like what I know about American history. So, the USA annexed Canada and Fallout. Wow. Yeah. I don't know. Do a history of the state of Florida. Oh my. The saddest state in the Union. No, the second. Florida's motto should be, at least we're not Mississippi. And Mississippi ain't got nothing. I'm sorry for Florida. That's a sad state. But yeah, Florida is I do actually have a friend of mine, a colleague, my former colleague, and she is an expert on Florida history, so I could just ask her some about this. But I do know at one point it was a Spanish colony, and then somehow it wound up in American hands, and I don't really know that story. And also I know that there was a Republic of West Florida that existed for like 10 days. But yeah, if you want to, David, if you want to submit that idea, I have a video idea webpage where you can submit video ideas and upvote ones that you want to see. Because I'm trying to like crowdsource all these video suggestions I got to see what people want. So I'm just gonna put that link in the chat, and you can submit it. And I would upvote a history of Florida. So I'd like to see what that's all about. I did have a plan to do a series, and I never, I've always been thinking about it, but it would be called Dead Countries, and it was going to be these histories of countries that don't exist anymore. And one of the ones that I had on that list to do was the Republic of West Florida, which I know only like lasted for, I think it lasted less than 2 weeks, but yeah. It'd be, but I do like, I want to make the alternate history scenario where somehow the Spanish lose Florida and the Americans don't take Florida, and just these like escaped slaves and the indigenous Seminole people make this country. And I was like, oh man, that'd be a cool Florida. It would be way better than it is now. What if the Whiskey Rebellion had succeeded? Oh boy, what that was over taxes on whiskey. I imagine if that had succeeded, I don't know, like the way that would have to have succeeded would be for major capitulations. So it'd be really hard for America to tax people, which, you know, would have resulted in a smaller federal government, which was already really small back then. But maybe without the whiskey tax, maybe you wouldn't end up with the resources to build Washington, D.C., and maybe the capital stays in either New York City or Philadelphia. All right, let's see. What if Marx is right and the USSR sparked a world revolution? We kind of already got into that. What if Danny Shays succeeded and there was no constitution? Ooh. So the president doesn't lead an army, yeah. Ooh, talk about dead countries as part of as a live stream. That might be fun. I know that that Dead Countries is a video series that I just never got around to, but I do know that I have a pretty good feeling that people would like that. I feel like a lot of people would like that series because Dead Countries. Oh, yeah, Fruit Dealer on Twitch is yeah. I'm also streaming on YouTube. I stream on both. Were there Native Americans in Florida? Yes, there was an indigenous. There are still Native Americans in Florida. They are predominantly called the Seminole people. A lot of them were driven out of Florida as part of the Trail of Tears and relocated to Oklahoma, I believe. And so there are a lot of Seminole Americans. There's like Florida Seminoles and there's like Oklahoma Seminoles, and like they have there's a whole like trying to rebuild their relationship and stuff. I think there might have been a few Cherokees who lived in Florida as well, but I can't be sure on that one. Because the Cherokees were like the most westernized of the indigenous people who lived in the original 13 states. Oh my, we're getting so many requests for things. Okay. All right, there's obviously so many of these that I totally should do another one of these because you guys are all giving me so many ideas. Only bro, you missed. We talked about what if America had got independence but became more of a dominion rather than getting full independence. And it ended up with an America versus the independent Republic of Louisiana or something like that. Yeah. Why is never spoken about the massive amount of oil, iron, and many other resources the USA sold and supplied the Japanese for years before Pearl Harbor? Well, because that doesn't feed into the narrative of Americans being heroes, and that's what history is for, to make America look good. So, we don't talk about it. We get orders from George Soros to not talk about it. What's it called? I got my signed check here from George Soros. Didn't you get yours? Doesn't he just give everybody on the internet money who says things? The sad part is that if I started saying right-wing things, that would actually happen, but I get money from the Koch brothers. If only I could be that unscrupulous, I'd be so much richer. If I was a right-wing pundit, I'd be, like, swimming in it. Did you get to that socialist revolutionary scenario? I think we kind of... I feel like it would be a little tough. We already talked a lot about the Soviet Union with the first scenario. To get into, like, what if the Soviet... because, like, we talked about it a little bit when we got into, like, the what if Lenin lived. Like, what if he lived, like, the USSR would have spread communism to a lot more countries, and I think it would lead to a lot more unrest and harm. Like, there'd be a lot more. There'd be like a proxy, like a Cold War starting way earlier than World War II, and probably diminish the power of fascism. Or if you want to go bigger, like a whole bunch of countries have big socialist revolutions, and so like the USSR is just a domino that leads to a bunch of countries becoming communist, which would just result in communist takeover of the world eventually, I guess, or at least a very short or very dominant communist world order. But I imagine that would only last so long before you ended up having the Sino-Soviet split, but like done over a bunch of things. Cultural Marxism is real, but it's the Koch brothers and it's right wing and it's just called think tanks. Thank you for that. A lot of the things that is accused of being cultural Marxist is usually just like, if you look at the history of what the neoconservative movement did in order to become relevant, it's basically like I have a video. I did a video on the neoconservative movement in 2016, I think. And you can talk about that a little bit, because like that is basically shows how the moneyed interests that came from the neocon movement essentially astroturfed an entire like branch of American political thinking that, you know, by starting magazines and hosting events and giving out awards and stuff like that, they managed to strong arm themselves into dominating part of an ideological space. What if Queen Elizabeth I never married? That did happen. Queen Elizabeth I did never marry. She was the Virgin Queen. They named Virginia after her. They named an entire state over the Queen not having sex. which is just okay, sure. Shows that priorities back then were a little different. Oh my. You get a lot of ads from PragerU. I really wish that I could block PragerU ads. They get so much Coke money. I guess that means, if you think about it, because PragerU ads probably run on my videos, that I take money from the Koch brothers. A little bit, anyway. Which, like, given that, like, you know, my entire career has been undermining their message, I guess means that they're giving me money to say the things that I say. Okay, where were we? So we had an America without a constitution. We've been doing a lot of American history. What do you think will happen when the Queen dies? Ooh. When the Queen dies, I mean, she probably did. Yeah, I mean, let's be fair. She was probably getting it on in some form or another. There's a lot of hearsay and rumor that she was anyway. I saw the movie. She had a thing. Anyways, so let's say Danny Shays. Hey, how's it going? Hey, ABC Kevin. Cheers. We're just doing a stream. Yeah, actually, there is. She can't. So there's two options we can go down. One, there is the really complicated and accurate one, which is the whole. There's actually a Wendover Productions video about what happens when the Queen dies, and it's actually like they've really planned it out. They have a whole thing in place. I think that it'll be really tragic to have to reprint like Prince Charles's ugly goddamn face all over all of our coins. Like, you guys in America won't have to deal with that, but like every single like loonie and quarter and dime is gonna have the like freaking melted horse face of King Charles on our freaking money. That's gonna suck. He's hideous. He is a hideous man. And he's gonna be on our money. And like, what's it called? Then the king after him, he like that is like then his son is like, isn't he pretty? Then we get a pretty king. Then we get a baby king. But so there's the likely option, which is that everything in the Wendover Productions video will happen. We get a bunch of new loonies. And they'll be like commemorative, as Canada likes to do. They like to have commemorative toonies for every single major occasion. So like they'll have a commemorative like memorializing Queen Elizabeth coin or something like that. Yeah, and then we would probably get, who knows, like, I mean, the other option is that we invent our immortality, like we hook her up to a machine that devours 10,000 souls a day in order to keep her perpetually alive forever. Basically as a skeleton, with a Byzantine bounce of machines that takes the sacrifices of thousands to maintain, and she just becomes the God Queen forever. You know, just like in the Warhammer. That's how I think the Warhammer thing works. Can't you guys just skip to Will? Be true. I don't even. Then we can warp into orc space. Yeah. Oh yeah, I forgot about how she like painted her face with lead all the time. That could not have been good for her health. Oh boy. Hey, cat. All right. So, let's talk about an America without a constitution. That's interesting. I think what were the problems in the American, the Articles of Confederation America that were kind of a mess that needed to be done with the Constitution? Well, main thing that was that they were unable to deal with any of the, they were pretty much paralyzed because they had this, you need to have a huge amount of votes in order to pass anything, and nobody agreed on anything. And so I imagine that very quickly after without a constitution, the American Republic would probably split up or fall apart, because there'd probably be a secession crisis pretty early on, and I just don't see the Articles of Confederation holding a country together for all that long. Without a constitution to sort of make leaving more difficult, I imagine that it would have been a loose coalition of countries, and if there was an Articles of Confederation America today, it would be much weaker, because they wouldn't be able to do much. And maybe more powerful states would have split off and become their own thing, and would just become reasonably wealthy countries on their own sails. It'd be a lot of little countries. Yeah. And they would be very different. Yeah, without all that freedom of speech stuff, who knows where things would have gone. Because you know that America was only kept together because by the part of the Constitution, the amendment that allows people to say whatever racist things they want without any consequences. No criticism, no deplatforming. Don't you remember it says that? It's the first part, the freedom of speech part of the Constitution, that the right to say racist shit on the internet without consequence shall not be infringed. You think I'm wrong? Look at the Constitution. It says it right there. The right to free speech shall not be infringed, or the right to frozen peaches and the right to say racist shit on the internet without any consequence shall not be infringed. Oh boy. Let's see, where are we getting here? What's a fun one to do? You're just staring at my cat. Oh, she's not exactly at her best right now. Ooh, what if Al Gore won? Al Gore. Be interesting. I actually would be very curious to find. I think Al Gore said in an interview once what he would have done if 9/11 happened under his watch. But given at that point there was a strong Washington consensus, I don't know if I'm not sure if Bush or Gore being president really changes much, except that Gore probably wouldn't have had as many neocons in his cabinet, so maybe the war on terror would have been a lot smaller. I think if 9/11 would still happen, and Gore's government would probably get more involved, or probably still do the invasion of Afghanistan. The invasion of Iraq probably wouldn't have happened, which of course means no ISIS, probably Saddam Hussein would still be alive. He'd still be running the country, probably. Christian wants to know what's my Halloween costume this year. I haven't been invited to a Halloween party yet, so and also there no trick-or-treating happens here, so I don't think I'm going to get a Halloween costume because I'll have nothing to wear it to. Yeah, so I don't really know what to say to that. I don't think I got a costume last year, and I might not this year unless I get invited to a Halloween costume at the last second. And if I do, I have a pretty okay 11th Doctor costume I can pull together real quick. I've got the fez and I've got the tweed jacket, as you guys all see in the videos, and I've got a shirt and I've got the suspenders and everything like that. So, and I got the old It's actually probably just behind me. If you can see, maybe it's out of shot, but I have a 11th Doctor sonic screwdriver, so I could pretty quickly throw together like a season 5 Doctor Who Matt Smith costume. Would the Revolutionary War have happened without the actions of the Boston Lodge? Maybe not. I mean, like the the Masonic, the Masons were able to be that kind of third hangout space, and because it was secretive, they could say things that would be considered seditious. So maybe the Americans have the Masons to thank for being able to secretly foment revolution. And talk about revolution without consequence. How about dressing up as a clown to scare people at the park in the suburbs? I feel like that would end up with me getting killed, to be honest. You know what though? When I did live in a house, I used to love giving out candy to all the kids. It's fun. They're adorable. Yeah, we used to like the 2 times that we lived in a house and we did trick or treating. We put on like Halloween music and a half-assed costume, and we gave out candy. It was really fun. I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah. I did do a 11th Doctor costume. Actually, I bought the jacket for the Step Back. The Step Back jacket that I wore in those videos, I originally bought as an 11th Doctor Halloween costume. And then, Halloween came and went, and I just liked wearing the jacket, so I just wore it. I just wear it whenever I have to dress up all nice and fancy. What is Halloween music like? Monster Mash and like Thriller and stuff. I don't know. Like I went to Spotify has like a Halloween playlist, and we just put that on. And then once it got a little bit later in the night, we put on the Misfits, because to me that's Halloween music. But I don't know. I remember it was I think the last time we did one was 2016, Halloween of 2016. And there was all these adorable people dressed as Rey, and there were superheroes, and I don't know. I like Halloween. I think Halloween is great for kids. I mean, we probably shouldn't give kids candy, but if we had to give them candy, at least getting them out and meeting their neighbors and wearing funny costumes and all that kind of stuff. I think that's, I don't know, it's adorable and it's great. I wish we did more things that involved you going and talking to your neighbors. What if I told you I was writing an alt history about monarchy Germany wins World War II and the Reich is this pan-European and the best nation to live in? Well, that says a lot of interesting things about your politics. I'd be very curious as to why. Is there some sort of movement of people who are really into the Kaiser of Germany, the German the German Empire, the Victorian one until the end of World War I? Is there? I thought that was just Emperor Tiger Star. Is there actually German Empire people? I guess that's what that. Isn't there a Darth Killoon? Isn't that a? Everyone keeps telling me that there's some big mod for Hearts of Iron 4 that basically this is that is this story. Does that have anything to do with it? The Kaiser Reich thing? That's a strange nostalgia. Germany, the the like Wilhelm II Germany, wasn't it like really militaristic and authoritarian and like colonial? Oh man, that's a thing. Yeah, Kaiser Reich. I did not know people were really into it. I thought it was just like an alternate history scenario that was like really well made on the Hearts of Iron mod community, so people just really liked it. But I guess there is like actual German Empire nostalgia people. That's a new thing for me. But it's more like, I like Victorian German culture and have a mild respect for Bismarck. Okay. I guess you like the spiky helmets or something? I don't know. I don't know much about Victorian German culture, to be honest. I just know that, like, the Kingdom of Prussia was known for being, like, super militaristic, but that's it. Syndicalist France, the Wobblies, all the good stuff. Oh, well. Doesn't sound all that bad. What if medieval Europe colonized Africa in like 600 or 800 years earlier? The only thing I would say to that is, and this is something that like CK2 doesn't do all that great, is that it's really hard to like maintain a kingdom that big back then when like communication lines were so slow. I don't imagine that a European empire large enough, like even like if Europeans went to Europe and were able to settle there, I don't think that they would be able to actually like build like proper colonies as like extensions of their country. They would be more like kind of like what happened in like Jerusalem, where they like put a crusader king in charge and like it became its own country. That's the only, like, I don't see like the logistics lines for an empire of such a size just don't seem tenable in Middle Ages technology without like, you know, compasses and like fast traveling ships. It just feels like it would be unwieldy to keep that together with a feudal system. I could be wrong though. Like the only colonies that were really able to be made in those period was like the Canarias Islands and Iceland, and Iceland became independent very fast. Take to Isaac Arthur of SFIA. Yeah, Isaac Arthur might have a better I like the logistics of running a kingdom across multiple continents like that. I think would just not be possible in the Middle Ages, especially like 600 or 800 years earlier. So like you're talking about like the 11th century, like, yeah, oh geez, countries at that point, like, this is some of the thing that CK2 doesn't really explain very well. Like, France was barely like, even though France existed like on a map, like France was barely able to keep, like if I was the king of France, I would be barely able to keep my own dukes in line and get them to get behind the things that I wanted to do, let alone like having like duchies like in Africa. I feel like they're like, if there was a thing that like CK2 has issues with, it's it assumes way too much coordination between and even then there's like a lot of discord between powerful, like between nobles in CK2, but it was even more chaotic than CK2 portrays, because like a king's ability to hold his kingdom together was tenuous at best most of the time. It wasn't until like the 1500s that kings were really able to solidify their rule in a really strong and meaningful way. There was like there's a really interesting thing that like kind of speaks to that, which is like around the year 1800 they did some of the first studies of European countries to just ask them like what languages everybody spoke, and they found out weird things like in 1800 less than half of people who lived in France spoke French, because they spoke all sorts of small dialects and local languages. And it wasn't until like the 19th century that like, all right, we're gonna have to get everybody to learn our language at some point. Jeez. Modern day Kaiser, so it's a modern day empire in Europe with monarchs like that. So like, okay, with monarchs loyal to the Kaiser, and then it's like constitutional monarchies. So this sounds like some sort of like strange constitutional empire, which that's interesting. It'd be, although like why would people stick with monarchs for so long when there's so many other ideas like republicanism or communism or all those other things that happened in the 20th century? What would like make the Germans cling on to like this like archaic institution that other countries were already in the process of abandoning early in the 20th century? Like Germany was like, even in World War I, the German Empire was like really old school compared to like France and like Great Britain. It was basically like a dictatorship compared to like France and Great Britain. So I'd be interested to see like why does everyone decide like just 'cause Germany wins World War I, they like who keeps how does that idea still stay afloat? I don't know. And yeah, there's Big Seltzer pointed out the whole thing about malaria, where colonizing Africa would be heavily stunted by us not really until we really mastered guanine, something like that. This like anti-malarial drug that we discovered in the 19th century. Like until we really got that down, it would be pretty impossible to make a big dent into Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. That's around the time the Mongols were on their campaign. Granted, they didn't go far into Europe, though. Still a mass of people in that area. Yeah. Yeah. I think that like if CK2 was a little bit more historically accurate, it would be in a situation where you would have like civil wars breaking out all the time, and you would have like one of the things that happened in the actual Middle Ages that like didn't happen in like that can't happen in the CK2 engine is like you had weird situations where like the King of England was also the Duke of Aquitaine, and the Duke of but the title of the Duchy of Aquitaine was still under the feudal authority of the King of France. And so like the King of England, who was technically also the Duke of Aquitaine, had to like give part of his income from Aquitaine to the King of France. And like that, like there's like a lot more like weird situations like that happened in actual medieval Europe that CK2 isn't really capable of functioning with, because it's trying to impose a very modern concept on how borders and territory work onto a time where it was sort of not really a thing that made sense. Hence why it's really hard to find any really good maps of the Middle Ages, because like it doesn't really work. Quinine is what I'm talking about. Yeah. The Mongols had a huge empire at that point, but the Mongols were unable to, like, the Mongols didn't super give a shit about like communication lines and logistics. Like the Mongol Empire worked because they knew like if anybody came back, like they would be in for trouble. Like rebellions against like Mongol empires were always expanding and collapsing like all the time. So like they're hardly like a model for like a really powerful empire, if that makes sense. Because like the reason why the Mongol Empire was so huge at like the largest extent of Genghis Khan was because a lot of the territory they had was like inhospitable, very low population density, and the second that Genghis Khan died, it fractured. So, like, I don't know. It's not exactly super stable. Kaiser also gave the Jews back Israel that eventually united with Georgia, Armenia, and Kurdistan to conquer the Middle East with German support, and that's what started World War. Okay, that sounds very intense. Sounds like the alternate. That sounds like an alternate history scenario that would be very popular. It's probably not my bag. It's not my cup of tea, but like, I can see that. I can see that going down real well with like the mapper community people. What would happen if Rome didn't expand and stretch itself to the point where it began to strain the empire and the Republic regained power after Augustus and they were able to last longer? Well, I think that they would... the problem with that is that Rome was sort of reliant on conquest and expansion to keep stable. Like, they needed the constant stream of treasure and slaves coming from the frontier in order to keep people happy. Because, like, they didn't extend citizenship rights to a whole lot of people. So I don't feel like the Romans would have been super great at keeping that kind of thing together. All right. Speaking of the Kaiser, what impact do you think a successful Hohenzollern Confederacy would have had on European history? I know it's unlikely to think a Hohenzollern... Okay. I imagine ABC Kevin, you can guess that. Because I can't even pronounce it, I have no idea what you're talking about. I am very bad at European history. It is not my forte. I apologize. Oh boy. Well, the Byzantines got Genghis Khan to convert to Orthodox Christianity. Think about like Genghis Khan and like Genghis Khan never went to Europe. Genghis Khan fought. It was like I'm trying to even think about Obadiah. Obadiah Khan was the person who went into Europe, and there was I mean, like, they followed this sort of weird Tengri religion that they were very open to just, like, meshing with other religions really easily. I don't know. Like, they would have been like, sure, we're Eastern Orthodox, whatever. Like, their conversions were never really all that wholehearted. You should buy Crusader Kings 1 because it's a really good game and you'll have a hard time keeping things together. Also, it's Hohenzollern. I still have no idea what that is. Ogadai Khan. See, I'm absolutely ruining all of European history. But yeah, Genghis Khan never invaded into Europe. It was Ogadai, who was, I think, Genghis Khan's son. I feel like I'm going to be wrong on that one too, but I feel like he was a relative of Genghis Khan anyway. What if the Byzantines mass converted the Mongols to Orthodox Christianity and remained in Siberia? Hohenzollern sounds like some sort of cheese. So I would think that in that alternate scenario, the Hohenzollern cheese would be the best cheese in Europe. That's my theory. What would happen if the Trudeau government had a harsh response to the October crisis, sectarian violence, full-on revolution? I don't know about that. That's pretty hardcore. But it was things were really weird back then. I'm not sure. All right, so Ogadai Khan was the son. Kublai Khan was the grandson. Oh geez. Converting a Mongol leader to Eastern Orthodoxy would be strange. They would probably, like, a lot of the stuff would probably keep them from being super into their, like, settled, or their, like, you know, rampaging, ravaging, like, wandering lifestyle. Like, there are times when Mongols convert to a religion, and or they kind of culturally adapt to certain ways, and then they sort of just settle and they change, and then they get conquered by Mongols who didn't do that. That happened a few times in China. Maybe you'd have some sort of weird, like, Eastern Orthodox golden horde thing get set up in, like, Ukraine or something, but then, like, you know, a bunch of Mongols show up and take them over, as, like, a lot of history goes. Oh, geez. Kublai Khan, isn't he the one that invaded, like, Korea or something like that? I'm oh man. And isn't Kublai Khan also the one who tried to invade Japan, but then, like, got stuck in a tsunami or something, and so all of the ships crashed and they never got to go there? And it's, like, a big part of, like, Japanese national mythology. Honestly, out of the Mongol leaders who were Christian, they were mostly Nestorian Christians, and Nestorians were viewed as heretics, not just by Rome, but also by Byzantium. Oh man, the Nestorians, that should be a video I do. The whole Nestorian heresy. Oh man, there's so many heresies that I could do. That'd be fun. Which Khan started the Black Plague? That would be fleas. I don't think any Khan was responsible for it. I think fleas were. Because, like, if you're talking about, like, the connection between Europe and Asia, like, that had existed for ages. Like, the Silk Road had been moving stuff between China and Europe since time immemorial. So, like, there's always, like, we kind of have this concept that Europe was, like, this isolated little bubble from the rest of the world, but really, like, there was stuff and people moving back and forth from all over the place all the time. Damn, Kublai Khan sounds like he's hardcore. Ogadai did the Korean invasion. Well, you should be doing this, not me. Fleas Khan, the great stepson of Genghis Khan. Oh gosh. Okay, dokie. I think we're getting silly now. What if the Kaiser of the Holy Roman Empire converted to a heretical faith? And then there were crusades against German Italy. You should, like, what's it called? You should make a custom ruler in CK2 and see how that goes. Spoiler alert, they'd probably lose and get invaded, and there would be a new Holy Roman Emperor very quickly. I do like how in CK2 you can go for a very long time worshipping Satan, which I think is the best addition they've ever made to the game. Yeah, that sounds erudita. That sounds a bit like like an old myth. But it does sound something like the Mongols are awesome. Yeah, I definitely think that the best thing that could happen. My favorite alternate history scenario for the Middle Ages is the Sunset Invasion DLC. That is my favorite thing to do when I play CK2. Is I will play a country for a while, usually like in like India or something, and just kind of like mess around and not really get too involved. But then trigger the Sunset Invasion, and then once the Sunset Invasion people show up, play as them. Because oh man, it's the most controversial thing in CK2, but I love the Sunset Invasion scenario. I love that, like, super Aztecs come from across the ocean and start messing up, like Wales and Spain and stuff. It's, like, my favorite. Especially when they start sacrificing, like, nobles and stuff like that. It's like, oh, God, this is so great. I love that, like, just Aztecs show up in medieval Europe and start messing up the place. It's my favorite. Yeah. Please tell me, Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, that there's, like, a bunch of really great Sunset Invasion alternate history stories, and that you have a big list to send me, because I want to read all of them. Japan has socialist syndicalist revolution in the 90s, since it was the only nation where people could acquire the Communist Manifesto. Okie dokie. Socialist Japan. Interesting. Especially because that's in the 90s. So it's after all the tiger economy stuff. So I'd take it. All right. Alrighty. So, all right. Then I think. All right. It's getting late. I think I'm going to call it a night. I think that we have expanded. We have so much more alternate history stuff to talk about. Obviously, you guys really want to see another one, so we should do one before long. But yeah, I really have to go to the washroom, and it's like 9:51. So let's call it a night. And this is a really great stream. Be sure to, if this is your first time here, to like and subscribe and everything like that. And I hope to hang out with you guys either on Thursday, if you can show up in the afternoon before a new video comes out, which is at 1 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, or you could go for next week, where I'll be here at this time. Anyways, I'm sorry I can't do one last scenario. You guys have a great one, and we'll pick this up. So if you have a good scenario idea, hang on to it, and we'll take care of it later. Anyways, bye, friends.